Quick intro. So I'm Tip, principal at Blackbird. We're an early stage investor and we love to meet founders as early as possible in the journey, as you'll hear with Vexev's journey today. We're based in Australia and New Zealand, and we led Vexev's pre-seed and seed rounds over the past 2 years. And personally, I've gotten to know John and Eamonn over that time, mostly spent at Royal Albert, talking about vascular diseases, which is a good segue to intro Vexev.
Awesome, thanks, Tip. So I'm Eamonn, and with me I've got my co-founder John. So I'll give you a bit of a background. So John and I actually met on our very first day of the PhDs, and we started together. I had a background in physics. John was a biomedical engineer, and we essentially just teamed up really early to start on this sort of huge mission, which was understanding how blood flow behaviors lead to vascular disease. And so the applications there is for early detection, but also prediction capabilities of where and when vascular disease will occur. And so it was after the PhD that we really co-founded Vexev and really set out to implement this, but on a really mass scale. And so vascular disease is the leading cause of death. Most people sort of know it as heart attacks, strokes, aneurysms. And often it's sort of seen as this sudden event, but in reality, it's really a long, slow progression of disease. And so patients often sort of present symptoms, and that's when they first get scanned or imaged. But we really should be proactively monitoring these patients, regular scanning. And so Vexev is really building that out to be able to bring the scanning to the patients so that they can be monitored regularly, scanned regularly, but also at their convenience.
Cool. And you guys, so just taking it back, you guys first met Nikki from Blackbird 4 years ago. I remember at that time, you guys had already kind of done quite a lot. You manually gathered and validated data for your thesis. You built relationships with the folks in the industry. One thing I wanted to mention was that I also remember your first pitch, and it wasn't the most beautiful deck. For everyone out there, it was really academic, had lots of writing diagrams, but I think what was so rare about that pitch that stuck with me was that you guys came in with a bunch of learnings rather than a bunch of assumptions, and you had that insight and you weren't looking for validation, but when you came into pitch, which is really rare. And part of that insight was that in order to create change within the system, you had to be outside the system to see how inefficient it was. So maybe let's talk about what you believed that your competitors or maybe the incumbents didn't, and what was the thing that was misunderstood?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we sort of noticed really early on when we were heading up to the clinic and spending time in the clinic is just there's no real routine surveillance or image-based surveillance for patients, and especially those that are at really high risk of vascular disease. It's still very much a wait until symptoms, and waiting until symptoms to then have that first scan. We could just see that, the problem there is ultimately you're going to wait until it's already at that late stage. And so that first scan isn't going to tell you how long disease has been there or how aggressive it's moving through. And ultimately the reason for this is just comes down to expense. There's really high costs as far as the imaging equipment, really high costs as far as the people that have been specifically trained on that imaging equipment. And then there's also, I guess, dangers to the patient. It would never be feasible to expect patients to have an MRI or a CT scan every week or every month or anything like that. There's just too much, I guess, exposure risk. And so we could just immediately sort of see that problem. And the reason we were going up to the clinic was really, as Eamonn said, our research was back then trying to understand the links between vascular flow behaviors and vascular disease. So for us, we needed to actually get realistic data, create realistic models, which involve needing sort of 3D scans from patients taken somewhat regularly. So we were kind of facing the same problem where we needed regular scans and we needed it to be safe, but we also really needed it to be in high detail. So the advantage for us being an engineer and a physicist up in the clinic meant also being at the start of our PhDs with a long road ahead meant we could essentially build our own system, and that's what we set out to do. So we built our own system to work in our own custom way, and really the advantages back then were that this system had a really low cost per scan. It was next to nothing. It was ultrasound based, so there was really very minimal risk to the patient. But what's, I guess, most interesting and the best part of this system was the whole all the components fit inside this one suitcase, this one random suitcase we bought online. So, I mean, the whole of Randwick would probably hear us rolling this suitcase up from UNSW all the way up to Prince of Wales Hospital. And so that's how the whole suburb knew that we were scanning. And so we actually brought that scanning to the clinic where patients were coming in, and what was cool was seeing some patients actually just start coming in weekly for their scans. But we scanned, I mean, so many patients, and what was really insane for us was just that in almost all these patients, there was always some form of vascular disease present. But what was really interesting was for some patients, this vascular disease was progressing week on week. For other patients, we'd scan them once, we'd see a fairly moderate form of vascular disease, and then months later we'd scan them again and it had barely progressed. So like that were the kind of early learnings we had, but getting this data was really good for our research. So we'd roll this suitcase up to the hospital, we'd roll it back with all our data, and what we were doing was from every scan that we'd taken, we'd create these 3D fluid dynamics models, and that's what then let us start understanding those links between the fluid dynamics and vascular disease, which was, really cool for research. But I mean, what started becoming pretty clear to us was really just that impact of us coming up there and carrying out that regular monitoring for those patients. And this wasn't a particularly special clinic that had high rates of disease for some reason. In fact, this would probably be on the better end. So we started looking into, I guess, the problem of vascular disease for these particular patients, which were patients with end-stage renal disease on hemodialysis. And we could see that this problem was fairly universal. It didn't matter if it was the Prince of Wales clinic in Randwick or any clinic across the world. So this really had us thinking that, I guess, our solution here had to really be applied at scale. We shouldn't be looking to do this, one clinic, two clinics. We need to figure out how can we, I guess, bring this service that we developed, this regular monitoring service, to as many clinics as possible. And so I guess the first step that we could see for that was, well, the problem holding us back from scale was the fact that us ourselves had to be there to do the scan. So as I said, we had to roll the suitcase there and we had to carry out the scan in our own custom way. So really the next step for us to make this like a commercially viable product was to remove ourselves, to automate ourselves out of that process. And so then think about, I guess, the implications of that. And that's what we're doing as Vexev. We're redeveloping this whole system, rebuilding it from scratch so that we still keep the components that make it a cheap scanning cost, cheap cost per scan, really safe for the patients. So we never want to have any barriers towards patients scanning regularly. We never want them to think, oh, it's too expensive or it's not safe. But I guess one of the most important aspects of what we're building at Vexev is that this scanning system has to be so simple to use that, we truly believe that patients could actually scan themselves. And then we think about the benefits of that. Patients that are like hundreds of kilometers away from their nearest hospital or radiology department, they now have access to the same level of monitoring and surveillance as those that live right next door in the major cities. And then we can think about, when applying this at scale, then the implications for then how medicine's practiced. We can have the world's best specialists and clinicians now collaborating and monitoring patients all over the place. We can have specialists taking on 10 times as many patients as they had before. And then, I guess to be more specific, we can have vascular surgeons. They now have an ability to plan their procedures. They can use the data that we're gathering to start optimizing their procedures over time, and even just quantitative tracking of patients before and after. And then I guess the final, major benefit that we can see is just for governments and insurance to really stand to benefit from a large group of patients now moving towards proactive monitoring and early stage interventions rather than the more expensive and often less successful later stage interventions.
That's awesome. Actually, before the learning, I'll take a step back and maybe talk about your StartMate journey. So you raised like 400K from us pre-seed, then you guys got to StartMate. So maybe let's talk about that. The awesome thing about that period of time for us actually was just watching you guys go from like hustlers, the bag rolling across the street, to like executors, like kind of transitioned away from your PhD academic life to this like company building mode. And at that time, you know, you're building your alpha with off-the-shelf components, you're scanning everyone's arm on Riley Street, you're mapping out like the network of nephrologists, and just kind of seeing your ambition 10x, which came through. That was such a special period of time. Maybe let's share with everyone kind of just the learnings that you had through that program, and what stuck with you, and kind of how did your ambition change?
Yeah. So I guess the biggest learning from us, especially coming from research, really was like the speed at which a company can move. And then I guess second to that would be having like a really powerful network. So StartMate was actually one of our first networks that we had as a company, and having the mentors inside it was incredible because they had like this multidisciplinary background. They came from diverse fields of different areas of business, and so they could advise us and collaborate with, I guess, the different areas of the business that we needed to really work on, and then ask the questions that were hard to hear but really could accelerate the company. Second to that would be the founders. Just having founders on the same level as us was so cool, but also like having founders like a few years ahead. So StartMate's quite been running for a long time, so having all these different stages of the company growth, they could give you insight, but you don't really have that before. And then also just having these people tell you what was like going right for them, but also what was going wrong for them, was just incredibly beneficial. And then part of what StartMate did was as actually we went to the US at the end of the trip, and one thing that was like really insightful for us was having these meetings really in person, because we found that having these meetings in person was very impactful, especially to the US, who saw, I guess, Australia really far away. So we wanted to, I guess, get rid of these perceptions that Australia is very far away. We're actually close. We're, I guess, a 14-hour flight, so we can fly from Sydney to San Francisco in 14 hours. And due to the time zone differences, we can actually arrive on the same day. So I guess like having these meetings was like a really good insight for us. I guess with COVID now it's a bit different, but hopefully it sort of changes later on. The second part to that was, I guess, this execution stage. So after StartMate, we just really started executing, and I think that was really the transition point from coming from like researching to really product development and commercialization. So I mean, that was a crazy period. We're like ordering parts from like Israel, the US, like like the Netherlands. And we're having all these meetings as well. So there was all this stuff happening, and we really wanted to just like build this device that was like, that was in our heads really. And so it consisted of two parts. Like the first part was the hardware. So the hardware had all these constraints of having to be cheap to scan, had to be quick, and it had to be safe. And essentially what we wanted was the patients put their arm on, would scan the arm, and then that data would be uploaded to the cloud. And so we're developing the software as well. So a clinician could just log in, see all their patients at once. They could see all the patients that were at risk of vascular disease and be able to sort of see and visualize what was going on. And that was all really coming together, and we really just wanted to, like, I guess, test it out and see the whole thing happening. And so actually, Tip, you're the first person to actually get it tested on, which was pretty cool. And then, yeah, so part of what we also did was at our co-working space 251 Riley, we had volunteers, and they would book a slot with us, and they'd just come to our little, cube. They would come and get their scan, and take about 5 minutes for the whole process. And John and I would sit back and watch them get it done, and it was almost crazy. It was like deja vu. It was like being back in the clinic, doing the whole patient scanning again, but this time it was like fully automated process, and like that was like just so crazy to see. Part of that was also, at the time, we just realized, we were no longer having to like wheel that suitcase up any longer. So it was like that. I think that's the tipping point of us like really transitioning.
I love
part of the sort of trials also was really just having engaged volunteers. Like they were really, I guess, curious what was happening. And that was good because, I mean, it's not every day that you get to see inside your arm And so being able to see the veins and the arteries was awesome. So it was like really, really interesting for sure.
That's like, I think just on that point, like when we were making the decision to lead Seed, and being able to kind of observe both of your velocity of growth as founders was such a huge factor for us as well. And it's actually not common to be so close to a portfolio company's journey. Like we're literally across the road from each other. But I think your level of communication and progress was what really helped build that conviction. And as you know, with like early stage companies, there's very little data to base your investment decisions on. So we relied heavily on the founder's ability to set themselves goals and then execute on those goals, which is exactly what you did. So maybe in the last 4 minutes, looking ahead, next 12 months, 18 months, challenges aren't product or technical anymore. It's really around distribution regulation. Let's maybe end by talking about the next year ahead and your vision.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as is pretty clear from the talk, we're initially focused on the first application, which is patients with end-stage renal disease who are on hemodialysis. And that's just really because we can see we can have the largest, quickest impact for these patients. There's advantages in the fact that the patients have to come to dialysis clinics 3 times a week for 5 hours. And then there's also, I mean, in light of COVID, there's more patients starting home-based hemodialysis now more than ever. So the whole remote monitoring part really is playing in today's times. As far as the next sort of 12 to 18 months, we're deep into the product development right now. We're working on both the device, and these are devices that we're expecting to have thousands all over the world. That's what we're building for. And then there's the cloud platform as well, getting that, I guess, clinic ready in time. And so we'll be starting clinical trials early next year. And as part of these trials, we'll be including patients that are in some of the most, remote, far away places. And what's really important for us is including just the most difficult patients and scanning in those most difficult environments in order to really stress test this so it's, ready for this large scale application. And ultimately, as far as the future, what we're looking to do is just build up the application. We're starting here with this first application. This will just let us get better at vascular monitoring. There'll always be improvements, but long term, what we're looking to do is basically be monitoring and scanning the patient's entire vascular system, not just for patients at risk, but for all patients. We like to think about, what happens there when suddenly everyone, healthy people, are having their whole entire vascular network scanned, weekly, monthly, every couple of months. What happens there? So we'll be building bigger devices. We want to make sure that we still maintain a low cost per scan, really very safe scanning, but really most important is the convenience. So, this might mean in the future we have scanning devices in people's homes. And so what that means is that our current future generations are able to scan their whole vascular networks and regularly monitor that throughout their lifetimes, we expect to see a massive decline in how many people are dying due to strokes and heart attacks, often seen as these slow and often unnoticed progressions until it's too late. And so ultimately, what is success for Vexev? Success for Vexev is just when these current and future generations are no longer dying from vascular disease. If we're talking about having years, potentially decades of a heads up before these kind of events can occur, then we think that can be a really massive impact, and the bigger the scale, the better, really. I'll just add to that as well. What's sort of really exciting for us is the fact that this is no longer just the two of us working on this problem. This is, we've got fantastic investors like Blackbird, StartMate. We've now got this growing multidisciplinary team under us, and so what's really awesome for us is seeing now how fast we're moving, it all coming into reality for us. I'd just like to say in the last 30 seconds, if there's anyone out there listening, if you're an engineer, a clinician, or literally anyone who's passionate about this or would like to get involved, thinks they can help, then, please reach out. The easiest way to reach out is through our website, vexev.com. We'd love to chat with anyone who wants to get involved.
And cool. One thing I'll note.
Sorry. Just the Wild Hearts podcast coming out next Wednesday. So if you want to hear more about Vexev, tune in for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay tuned. More stories to come.
Yeah.
That's it.
See ya.